attending our third CIBSE technical seminar. This is the first of the mechanical, and we've had 2 electrical already, and this one is based on CIBSE Guide M. Our speaker today is Stephen Gathergood from G4S, who will be sharing all the information today. Welcome, Stephen, please, if you don't mind, in the normal way.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Oh, that's better. Right. Okay. So this evening, yes, I'm going to take you through the most recent version of CIBSE's Guide M. So this was put together as a build on the last version, which was put together in 2007. So it's taken 2008. So it's taken some 7 years to get to us. And effectively, what I'm going to do today is take you through a journey through all of the chapters. It is guidance, so this needs to be interpreted for your specific use, depending on what role you play in construction. So it is aimed at, as it says on the slide, designers, maintainers, operators, FMs, and really it's trying to bridge the gap between what all those individuals, the parts that they play in terms of good construction projects. So rather than designers designing, builders building, maintainers maintaining, what it seeks to do is to try to pull everybody together so that effectively we build better buildings as a cohort, as a team. So in simple terms, hopefully over the next 40 minutes, I'm going to take you through each of the chapters. What you will take from it will be slightly different depending on your role within the built environment. But what hopefully it will do is help you look at energy and how you can reduce costs, importantly both at the design stage and cost in use, to look at specification selection in terms of durability, life cycle, how to build your OPEX and your CAPEX budgets, which obviously is fairly important to the finance man. Give a touch on the importance of sustainability in the environmental agenda, which of course we all know is gaining weight every day, and help you to meet the funding criteria of your organisation, and in some instances give you some guidance as to where you can get additional funding that might come from other government organisations and schemes where you can actually use, for example, the enhanced capital allowances process and other type models. So to come back, it's originally it was produced in 2000 under a different title. It has been produced solely by volunteers, some of whom are there. Now, again, this is people that all sit in different commercial organisations. So this isn't about commercial gain for any organisation. This is about people with a skill set and a thirst for improvement in the built environment coming together to make things better. But importantly, and we'll come to it later on, this is the first time that RICS, BISRIA and the Building and Environmental Services Group have come together with a common set of standards and a common approach to a number of aspects of assets and asset management. So what you're seeing here now is something which will give you a common framework across whichever organisation you decide to pull your information from. So, starting at the beginning, what we're looking at here now is effectively Guide M tries to bridge the gap across a number of key documents. So you're all aware of BIM, which is now gaining pace, certainly in terms of its move towards the second stage in 2016. SFG 20, you'll be aware, has been completely overhauled of recent and continues to move to get better use within the built environment, configurable, and as a consequence is being sold now as the base standard, if you like, for maintenance activity. BS 8544 is the relatively new British standard on life cycle costing, and the new rules of measurement number 3, which is about cost in use and maintenance for overhaul and renewal, all wrapped up in the fabulous Deming Plan Do Check Act. And of course what it looks to do is to take the whole operational piece through life, compliance, to basically knock down and start again. That's the overarching principle of what we've tried to do with the various chapters. So chapter 2 is about guidance for designers. So fundamentally what you already know, talk to facilities managers. It still doesn't happen often enough. It's been promoted out there that early engagement and early adoption is key. It's been said for years, but for whatever reason, there's still a bit of a barrier there to that level of engagement, possibly because of the way some of the contracts are put together, possibly because some construction companies have got no idea about what's going to happen or even how the building's going to be maintained after it's finished. But if you can, get FM and operator involvement. So what I'm saying there is, we don't ask for much, and I'm talking now from an FM background. Give me something that's safe. Give me something I can maintain. Make it simple. Don't make it overly complicated. It doesn't need to be half the time, but designers, and forgive me if you are a designer, I know you like flair and you like building in your own sort of personality into some of those designs. I guess what I'm saying as an operator, if it doesn't need to be complicated, don't make it complicated. Give us something that is economic to run, gives me good performance, and please consider the whole life, not just the initial construction cost. Through life costs, if I was to quote the 1 to 5 to 200, which some of you may have seen that ratio, for every pound spent on a capital investment cost, it costs 5 in terms of its energy cost and 200 for its ongoing OPEX through life of the building. Again, people don't seem to take that into recognition, but they are significant numbers when you talk about the entire UK property portfolio. What we've also done, and you may have seen this before, is we've enhanced slightly well, it's a section there. There's a spreadsheet which is aimed to, not spreadsheet, a flowchart rather, which is aimed to help the designer ask the right questions at the right time in relation to all of the considerations that he needs to make as he goes through a new project. It actually looks like that. So there's lots of things, and apologies you can't see it, but there's lots of things in there that need to be considered from a design perspective. And a lot of the things in the 3rd column and the 4th column are about how does that impact on the operator? How does that impact on the facilities manager? How do I maintain it? So for me, if designers embrace this type of methodology, we're all going to be a little bit better off as we move forward into the operational stage. Chapter 3 talks about maintenance strategies and techniques. So I guess a few questions just for me to be provocative. What is the right maintenance strategy for my building? I've got operation and maintenance manuals. Well, there we go. Why do I need a strategy? What was actually envisaged by the team at the design stage that put the design together? How was it intended to operate? And probably most importantly, and I think it's a real frustration for a lot of people, why the hell am I having to cut my budget already? Because I should have a building that I can maintain affordably. So, what is a maintenance policy? Again, Institute of Asset Management, you've probably all heard of 55001 or 55,000. It's moving, it's gaining pace. It's now an ISO standard. A number of organisations are now adopting. So yes, you do need a strategy. We do need to understand. If you don't have one, you'll bumble along, you won't manage your bottom line, your building won't perform properly. Historically in Guide M, as I mentioned to begin with, there were lots of different approaches. It was very experiential. There was no links between different organisations. So importantly, that link now that I mentioned before between RICS, BE&S, CIBSE, BISRIA, it brings together a framework. We now have arguably credible data upon which to actually make informed decisions. We've never had that before. So we can now better manage risk and we can now better manage cost. Those are the documents that I've mentioned, but again, it's about application. This is guidance. You need to apply it to your particular building within your particular business, be it single site or be it portfolio driven. What is the requirements of the core business and how can you apply these standards, these guidance notes to make it work better? What are your priorities? What does the business do? What's its prime function? Have I got a compliance standard in there? What type of assets am I maintaining? Am I applying something which is business critical and I'm very cognizant of uptime? Or am I looking at run to fail? Doesn't really matter too much. Needs to be considered. What maintenance techniques can we apply? Well, there's a whole raft of them. O&Ms, SFG20, what does the original equipment manufacturer specify? Condition-based maintenance, reliability-centred maintenance, maybe a blend of all of them. All words that I'm sure many of you have heard before, but probably few of us really understand. If we want to understand some of this more, we need to go into the aeronautical industry. Good evening. That's where they've really got this right, because you don't want planes dropping out of the sky. There's also more modern terms, critical environment management, critical environment and risk management. Business-focused maintenance. These are brands that are put together which look very much at the business process and attune the maintenance strategy to allow for failure of particular assets that aren't important, but focus the cash that you've saved onto those assets that you need to ensure uptime. I think what we need to take away from this is that maintenance definitely isn't a one-size-fits-all. So risk assess, look at how important it is to your business and apply a maintenance strategy using these types of guidance to inform what best suits you. And of course the monetary thing comes into this as well. So you can help your finance director. So depending on what you choose, you can give him saving. You might decide that you just want to go down a statutory only maintenance. Now that might be great for short term, but there'll be a risk that comes in and a bit of a sting at the tail later on. And some unscrupulous contractors, of course, will use that to their benefit because they know they're on a short-term contract. And then, of course, the client picks that up at the end and they probably don't get any repeat business. So what does a maintenance strategy look like? First graphic, bit busy, but in essence, what I'm trying to say here is there's three approaches. You can look at individual assets, you can look at your asset systems, and then you can look at asset portfolios. And from that, you can look at asset life cycle, cost, risk, performance. At an asset system, it might well be that it's slightly wider, and again, that's more about performance optimization. And then in terms of the asset portfolio, if you've got multiple buildings, about where do I put my capital investment? Which are my flagship buildings? Which ones do I want to keep operating, possibly at the cost of another? So again, it comes back to business importance. So what I've also shown on the left here is again the way SFG20 is now being configured. You have essentially four types of maintenance. You have your statutory, mandatory, what's being called either business critical or functional critical or function critical. I don't like the word discretionary, but that's what we've called it. Discretionary maintenance, or routine is probably a better word. So the top two are really your compliance model, the must do, keeps you out of jail. And then the blue box underneath is really a maintenance model, and that's where you can start to play tunes. If you want to start cutting back on your function critical and your discretionary or routine, you can do. Don't play with the top two. That's a recipe for disaster. But again, looking at that, you can again start to help the finance man. In the middle, when you're looking at asset systems, again, there's a methodology which Guide M suggests where you can look at importance. So again, it's if I've got a portfolio, how important are my buildings? What's their functional priority? And again, under the asset portfolio, what's the condition? So I'm now looking at condition, I'm looking at the remaining life of my asset, how energy efficient is it? It might not be life expired, but I might choose I want to capitally invest in it because actually it's giving me better energy consumption, reduced carbon. Again, depending on what the organisational drivers are, you can make decisions, but once you understand what it is that your assets are doing. There's other things that space utilisation, resilience, capacity, all sorts of assessments, which again we'll come on to some later. Maintenance contracts. Guide M tries to give some guidance around how to buy maintenance contracts. There's a lot of uninformed clients out there that don't necessarily know what it is they're buying. They'll approach contractors and say, we'd like you to maintain our building, please. And the contractor will say, no problem at all, it's going to cost you X. But unfortunately, the client doesn't know what it is that he's getting. And that might be good, that might be bad, probably the latter. So it talks about the need for public-private sector restrictions. You may have all heard of OJU. Again, I'll not read it verbatim, but again, it's about best value. It's about giving open and transparent equal opportunities to all. Procurement methodologies, a whole raft of things. SLAs, so we can have an SLA-driven maintenance contract. It could be labour only. It could be just purely inspection and test. It could be PPM, SFG 20 baseline, just go do that please. Or SFG 30 if mothballed. It could be fully or semi-comprehensive, and that might be thresholds which can be tuned to, again, the level of risk which the organisation may want to take. Call out only. I've already mentioned it could be statutory only. It could be directly employed labour supported by specialist contractors for equipment that can't be maintained by your normal trained multi-skilled technician. Again, however you approach it with some level of cognizance of what it is you're buying, assess the risk to the organisation and make sure that you're buying the right thing. So it's about appropriateness. Value-based, most contracts are. It's either an informal or a formal tender, could be a negotiation. Generally speaking, a fairly nondescript pre-qualification. There's some great PAS standards for pre-quals. Use them. It will help you. It will limit your risk. Don't forget anti-bribery and anti-collusion clauses. Quite out there at the moment with a number of things that have gone on in the past. Form of contracts and payment mecs, it talks about the various different types of purchasing that you can do, and it gives some guidance around documentation. It also talks about the importance of mobilisation and in fact demobilisation and the time that needs to be allowed. Personal view, a lot of contracts fail because they're mobilised very poorly. And that's because it's so much time seems to be taken up with the process of evaluating cost, and then it's a case of, great, we'd like to contract with you, can you be up and running tomorrow? Again, that's the uninformed client that's actually creating their own problems. And don't forget insurances and damages, and there's a whole raft of indemnities that, again, Guide M helps you through and tells you what they are. So, any form of contract, yeah, there's a number of them out there, and it's not exhaustive, but Guide M gives you a little bit of guidance, and I've given an extract there in terms of table 4.1, but what that does is that takes you through a number of pros and cons in relation to different contracts that are available. I think what I'm seeing is that the NEC3 is now taking a prevalence out there. The FM contract within by the CIOB, it had a bit of a flurry in 2008 to 2010, but it's not been embraced by, funnily enough, by FM contractors. What you see with the NEC3 is that gives you a lot more choice in terms of the transfer of risk, which a lot of clients like to look at, and therefore it seems to be more adaptable. But again, that's a personal view. The table in the guide gives you a lot of detail around which one you could choose. Right, chapters 5 and 6, I've lumped these together. So it talks about energy efficiency, it talks about controls. So in essence, it gives some guidance around the importance of an energy strategy. We're obviously all aware with the building regs came in, metering strategies, were they really adopted? They were misunderstood. Some people went the whole hog and you had a meter on absolutely everything. Some people didn't. And again, it sort of lost its way a little bit. So what we've tried to do in Guide M is to put a little bit of structure around that. We've also tried to talk about the importance, again at the design stage, for relating back to energy benchmarks. TM46, as I mentioned there, is a great document, empirically based, and a really good guide for actually checking that actually your building has been designed with some form of performance built in. Again, it talks on lighting, generally electricity, refridge, talks about energy legislation, and it even picks up the most recent ESOS, because that was coming out at the time that we were writing this. And it also talks about the importance of fuel choice. Again, when I used to be in private practice as a designer, we used to spend a lot of time analysing different fuel types for the client and looking at the cost of his particular building over a 5, 10, 15-year term. It doesn't happen so much now. Everybody goes straight for gas or the lowest carbon intensity, which generally speaking is going to be green electricity these days. But things like CHP are now coming to the fore. So again, what we've done here is to try to reinforce the fact that there are different fuel choices that need to be considered. Controls. It takes you back to Janet and John, bearing in mind who this guide is aimed at. So this is aimed at people right from the bottom up, the FM that might be uninformed. What are they for? What are the maintenance requirements? Building management systems. Interesting point, the next one. Controls, are they obsolete the day that you've finished putting them in? It's a massively fast moving area. Something which we need to be cognizant of, and again comes back to the point made before about if you don't need to make it complicated, don't. Keep it simple. And we also talk about the importance of training. I don't know here what people generally feel, but BMS systems have had this unfortunate view that they are a black art, that nobody really understands them. Two pieces of code to achieve an output can be written by different engineers in a different way. People like Trend and Schneider and others have tried to demystify it. I would suggest without not a great deal of success. But again, what we've done in Chapter 6 is to try and put a bit of structure again around that and help make that clearer for people. The solution should be appropriate. There's a theme here, isn't there? It should be proportionate to what it is that you're controlling. Sledgehammer to crack a nut comes to mind. So what's the control system there for? It's not for the designer to show his clever flair and the fact that he's really good and he can make it sing and dance. It's there for that. It's energy use, optimization, and occupant satisfaction. That's what ultimately it distills down to. And what I've shown at the bottom there, again, you may have seen it before, but it's just giving you an indication of that between the range of manual control, which to be fair has a place, let's not discount it, manual controls does work, right through to integrated controls, the more you move to the right, the higher the cost. And that's not only capital cost, that's ongoing maintenance cost, ongoing cost of change, increasing rate of obsolescence, the list goes on. So again, my message here is, if you don't need it to be integrated, then don't. A bulk standard, low-end building management system might be okay. Proportionate, appropriate to the task. And if you're further interested, Knowledge Series 04 is quite old now, but again, still some very good stuff in there. I couldn't help but put this slide in, because I don't know if anybody saw it, but in the CIBSE Journal supplement this month, Julie from Hawley had done some work in a hotel, and the comments are coming back on TripAdvisor. So the whole concept of post-occupancy evaluation now and user feedback, it's gone beyond the handing out of forms and saying, how good was that? Was that fit for purpose? Did it perform well? Was it clear? It's now out there where it's not overly complicated. It's been graphically designed to try and help the user understand with a mixture of words and pictures. And people are writing feedback on bloody TripAdvisor. I mean, it's incredible. But that just tells me that from a building services perspective now, there are more people out there becoming more aware of their environment. So we're going to have lots and lots of critics going forward. So we need to sit up and we need to listen now that controls need to be appropriate. Chapters 7, 8 and 9 consider commissioning, testing, handover and O&M documentation. So for me, possibly the most important area for a facilities manager. It's got to be commissioned properly. Well, we all know what happens in construction programs. It all gets squeezed. It doesn't necessarily get done properly. You get something which doesn't necessarily perform the way that you want it to perform. And why does that happen? Well, generally because the builder's under a financial penalty if he doesn't hand it over on time. So what Guide M again tries to do is it tries to say it's important, allow adequate time. Obviously the early engagement with the FM or the operator at the front end will help the designer and the constructor allow the programme accordingly. Importantly, post-completion testing, fine-tuning. You've all heard of soft landings. That's now taking again some increased pace with, in fact I think I've got a little booklet here on it. Yeah, soft landings, government soft landings, you may have seen that. If you haven't, then again, freely downloadable off BISRIA's website. But again, grabbed hold of by the government, it's something we're not going to get away from. And actually for FMs that's really good, because there's arguably a 3-year period of aftercare provided by the designer for making sure that the building does what it should do. So it's the Ronseal test. Does it do what it says on the tin? Seasonal commissioning, regional recommissioning and continuous commissioning, phrases that you may or may not have heard. But again, how many times does a building get recommissioned during its lifetime? It changes. Greater load, people, IT changes, your chillers or your fans or whatever it might be are working harder. It's maybe a good idea to think about going back and just testing, does the building still do what it should do? And interestingly, it's actually mandatory under the US Food and Drug Administration to actually do a periodic validation around the performance of the building. In the UK at the moment, we don't have that. The building's built, it's commissioned, it's operated. There's nothing that forces us or even suggests that we go back and test that it's still doing what it should have been doing when it was handed over. You'll not be surprised to know that Guide M actually does suggest you go back and you check. And then of course there's the decommissioning and mothballing if that's appropriate. So carrying on, handover procedures, it talks about the importance of, or not the importance, but the process around if you have sectional completion or beneficial use, partial handover. It gives you some templates, but again, for you to augment, tailor to suit your particular building and environment. around inspections, snagging and defect management. Importance of user and operator training. What equipment do I need? What specialist support do I need? What does the handover information look like, and how does that procedure work? How do I manage warranty? How do I manage warranty transfer? Again, not often done. And defects liability. O&M documentation itself, well, what does an O&M look like? Lots of documents written on what an O&M looks like, but most of them have the MK catalogue in them. That's not what it's supposed to be. It's about operating procedures, it's about fault finding, it's about how you should be operating the particular assets and the systems to achieve what we've talked about earlier, which is occupant satisfaction and supporting the business process. OEM literature, health and safety files, building user guides. Now that's interesting. Those were introduced in Part L of the building regs, really around energy. It should capture everything that you deal with, so any modification you make, any plant enhancement, any change, you should be recording it, tracking it, monitoring what the impact on energy is. And again, he says bringing it with him. Again, another really good document. I know you say that because I helped write it, but no, it is another really good document. Building user, again, BISRIA again. People aren't doing it. There are, if you go to numerous buildings and ask the FMs, can I see your building user guide or your building logbook? A lot of them haven't got them. A lot of lip service, but it's a building regs requirement. So arguably it's a compliance issue. BIM, importance of, and again that's more now for buildings that are coming online. And lastly, integration with CAFAM systems. If you don't capture your assets at the right time, you don't integrate it properly with the CAFAM system, you're not going to get the output. You will not be able to comply with the compliance model. You won't know what it is that you're switching on and off in terms of your maintenance model. If you don't get your CAFAM right, you're on a recipe for disaster. I've then lumped the next few together. These are all about procedures, generally. So, Chapter 10 talks about the importance of operational risk management. Again, you probably all know this, but again, it talks you through the process, step by step, of identification of hazard, harm and loss, risk assessment, the importance of record keeping and managing those records, constantly revisiting, reviewing and updating, dynamic, a live document. It's not do it once, put it in the drawer, tick the box. This is really important, because if you don't get this right, again, somebody, maybe not you, but possibly your boss, I don't know, somebody will end up with potentially a big issue around their shoulders. Vicarious liability will kick in, and your organisation will then end up, more than likely, having some form of fine. Business risks, hazard and operability studies. I don't know that many people do those, but again, a great tool. What if scenarios. Again, run them, test them, prove that you know how to operate your system. What happens if a critical asset falls over? How do you respond? So it's a bit like disaster recovery and business continuity, but in a framework. Review it regularly. Very important. And also, it doesn't just stop at the operational stage. You revisit it through audit, and the bit that everybody forgets is there's a completely different set of risks when you come to disposal. But we should be thinking about it, because we should be thinking about through life. Maintenance audits. Again, very important, helps you understand what it is you're looking after. Supposed to be objective, not subjective. Importance, therefore, to have some form of structure to it, and again, Guide M gives you some indication of a template, but it also does refer to other industry documents which have gone a little bit further in terms of the mechanics of how you actually do that. Further, Maintenance management audits. So it's not just about the doing the work, it's about how is it managed. It's about the maintenance service, again, depending on your procurement methodology. How do you manage your comms? How do you manage your records? Can you lay your hands on that last Lola certificate quickly and easily? How are you managing health and safety? What's your accident incident rate? What's your near misses look like? How are they tracked? Are there any trends? In managing it through audit and compliance, you start to get a flavour. You can bring up the quality of your building and your delivery. Technical proficiency is in there as well. Quality assurance. How do you manage your spares? How do you assess which spares it is that you need to hold? How do you look at what's available short-term, medium-term, long-term? Do you classify it by value? Do you classify it by importance to the business? What happens if? So again, understanding what all that looks like. Energy use, environment and sustainability, financial management again. All of those are different types of audits that need to be undertaken. If you don't do them, then actually you could argue you've lost management control. You're just, again, bumbling along, doing what you should be doing in terms of task. This is about managing a process. CIBSE also recommend in there a suggested audit scoring system and an audit procedure. It's a generic one, but it can be tailored to meet all of those different subject areas. Chapter 14 is about condition surveys. So what does that mean? There's the definition there from a rather outdated British standard, but it's still fairly true. When should they be done? Well, condition surveys are important right the way through the building. So at pre-purchase, if you're an acquirer or a property developer, pre-contract, post-contract. You can use them for your forward maintenance register if you're a maintenance contractor to understand what's coming around the corner. Help your finance man again in terms of giving him an indication that you're going to have a bit of a big peak maybe in 2016. Or maybe it's just good practice and it helps financial planning. What's suggested is that you should be really looking at maybe a condition survey wholesale on a 5-year basis. Maybe a 20% sample year on year, so you've got a rolling condition of your property stock and your assets. But again, that's a generic, general observation. It may be different depending on the type of property that you're in. So again, it's down to you as the operator or maintainer to assess that relative to your business. The level and depth, well, why are you doing it? A lot of condition surveys are non-destructive. It's not feasible in a lot of buildings to actually take plant down, strip it, look at it properly, ultrasonic testing, all of that type of stuff. It's not really viable in a lot of environments. It may have a place, but maybe not so much in what I'll call domestic building services, probably more appropriate in places where you've got things like oil refineries and other high-risk environments where actually that loss is going to be pretty considerable and potentially a risk to life. CIBSE recommend a grading structure in terms of priority and condition. And they also talk about how to capture that data. Numerous ways, from paper-based through to your iPad, which is pre-populated and tick a button and out comes an output. So a number of ways to do it, but the principle is identified. The interesting thing is that what we can now do as well is link this back to what I mentioned before in terms of the NRM 3 classifications, which we've adopted. So the structure, I don't know if you can see that very well, the structure now that's been put forward and adopted within Guide M aligns with those documents. So we've got a group element, an element, a sub-element, a component and a sub-component. Which one of those is an asset is up to you to decide, depending on your strategy and how you want to upgrade and input to your CAFAM system. You may decide that you want to deal with an asset is, for example, a sub-element. If that asset is business critical, however, you may want to input assets at the sub-component level. So depending on how you want to tackle the management and the maintenance of assets will define their importance within your particular building. Health and comfort. It gives you some guidance around what to look for in terms of indoor air quality. It reinforces the importance of both pre and post occupancy assessment and monitoring. It refers to TR19, which you're probably aware of, which is now a British standard in itself, brought out in 2011, and also talks about the need for quality, air quality and health and safety monitoring during refurbishment projects in live buildings. Again, it doesn't happen too often, but it's something which maybe should happen, particularly now that we've got, and I haven't heard it for a while, but the sick building syndrome piece, the fact that ductwork cleaning and inspection is rising up the agenda. This whole area is something which I think needs a little bit more focus, and what Chapter 16 tries to do is put some further structure around the various points of information that you can go to guide you around what intervention you need to make as a maintenance person. Training, Chapter 17. Right, so yeah, this is an area which you shouldn't really be using to cut costs. Any organisation is only as good as its people. So I guess the message is don't do it. So there are a number of things within this section which we've touched on. The management of training, competency management systems. This is a big area that I think the industry has recognised of late that is somewhat lacking. And there is a recommendation at the moment for CIBSE to produce a further document on this, which actually goes to committee on the 21st of this month. And the idea is that the output of that is going to help define what competency is, how you manage it, how you maintain it, and also trying to draw the fact that you don't just get competent overnight. And actually, if you don't work at it, you can lose it. There is an increasing trend in legislation and regulation that calls for competent personnel. It doesn't define what that competent personnel is or how you achieve it. But there are some, and I've listed a couple there, that actually do define a specific standard that needs to be achieved. So, and as an example there, if you've not got your city and guilds in gas safety, then you will not be deemed competent to work on gas systems. That's sort of obvious, really, isn't it? But you would wonder if that applies across the various trades that technicians are dealing with. Talks about the need for training policy, needs assessments, planning, intervention, frequency of reassessment. How is that training provided? What level of certification should there be? How is it evaluated? Is it evaluated on its own or part of a pool? Is it evaluated person against person? And what that refresher training should look like. And I guess the most important bit on that slide is all training needs to be risk-based and it needs to be proportionate to the risk of the task. So the example there is you don't need to be a fully fledged 16th or 17th edition electrical engineer to change a light bulb. Chapter 11 and 12, these are probably the two chapters that have had the most significant overhaul. So BS 8544, which is the British Standard on Life Cycle Costing, those cost categories have now been identified. They've been carried forward into NRM and referenced back into Part M here. Cost attributes have been identified in terms of capture methodology, what are the units of measure, application of special on costs. So there's a lot more detail now around how costs are captured, so we've got a common playing field. Benchmarking has also been addressed in Chapter 11, and again there's a useful British standard on that as well, or Euronorm on that, which again helps to look at how you benchmark maintenance costs. It is specifically about maintenance, and it talks about how you capture your information, or makes a recommendation, should I say, and it might be, as I've said there, building, system, or at task level. How do we utilise labour? So again, it looks at planned versus reactive. It looks at impact on maintenance backlogs. So this might be as a direct result of the strategy that we talked about in Chapter 3, which is that I'm only going to do statutory maintenance. So actually I've now got a backlog. How do I deal with that? Is the cost that I've saved likely to be fully recovered, or is it now going to cost me more to deal with the backlog? Probably not, but I would suggest that if you saved £100,000 by doing statutory only, in dealing with the backlog, you might still have to spend £80,000. It's not what you think. The return and the saving is not demonstrable. Budgetary control and operational alignment. So again, Guide M gives you some help around how do you deal with capital investment. It gets a little bit theoretical in terms of working out paybacks, net present values. Again, really giving you some guidance, again, how to engage your financial director in terms of talking his language as to what you can and can't do in relation to helping him achieve that bottom line target. And that little graph was just on there just to sort of give you a bit of colour, because there's lots of words on this, really just telling you what you already know, and that is that as cost increases, it becomes uneconomic relative to the level of risk of replacing that asset. So what it's basically saying is, if you can, work in the blue zone, use an informed judgment about replacing your assets that are at risk at the right time. Because if you leave it too long, it's going to fall over and it's then going to cost you an awful lot of money. Right, what we've also done now is aligned with those documents at the bottom the importance of life factors. So this is economic life factors in terms of life of assets. How can we use those to inform not only the condition assessment that we talked about earlier, but also looking at those in terms of budget and renewal predictions. So this is about life cycle renewal or major overhaul. Assessment again of what does that mean in terms of predictable components, significant component failures. So going back to that asset structure I showed you earlier, there will be some components in there which you know will need replacement at some point during the life of that asset, which will prolong its life. And what we've done is we've used all of those factors across all of those documents, so we've now got that consistent approach. I'll go on in a minute to talk about what those variation factors are, but for the purpose of this slide, this is really about just saying, in terms of other financial considerations about how to manage your life cycle budgets, there are a number of models. Not all will be appropriate to particular businesses. Some might be good for larger businesses, some might be for smaller. Sinking funds is a fairly obvious one, it's been around for years. Depreciation, capital allowances, it talks about taxation, and as I mentioned, subsidies. And I guess what I'm trying to say here is that in terms of the phases of a system, there's obviously the acquisition bit at the front and the disposal at the end. Can't do much about those. But this bit in the middle, the use and maintenance and the renewal and the adaptation, if you look at what chapters 11 and 12 tell you, it will help you manage your assets to a performance level that will sustain your business at lowest cost. And that is about knowing when to intervene before it becomes broken and it costs you more, but not too early such that you're destroying value. So, in terms of variation factors around the application of what's now in Schedule 12, which are the life cycle or the life factors, there are a number of variances which need to be taken into consideration, and people don't. People go straight to the tables and they look at a pump or they look at a boiler and it says 25 years and that's it, verbatim, job's a good one. Wrong. You need to look at the asset, you need to look at where it's installed, you need to look at the impact of how old is it, technology, so we come back to the controls thing. Is it still viable? Is it obsolete? How was it designed and specified? What type of building is it in? How has it been maintained? What are its hours of operation? How was it installed? And is there adequate space for the maintenance personnel to maintain it properly to a defined standard? If you apply those factors, you don't always get the answer that you first started with. So whilst that pump in an ideal world or that boiler might have a 25-year life, when you look at its environment, it may only actually have a 20-year life. Now, some of that you can influence, but some you may not be able to influence, particularly if you've inherited a maintenance contract. You don't know what the previous contractor did. So therein lies the importance back of the audits and the condition assessments that I touched on earlier. The Schedule 12 is broken down again to align with the NRM3. So the economic life, well, what you've got is you've got the code, which links back to SFG 20. I'm very mindful of time here, I'll speed up. You've got the maintainable components broken down again to a level of granularity that looks at significant components. The economic life in years, initial indicative economic life. Any comments, now that's important because an example there, you see it depends on material type. So the life of this particular heating system will depend on the tube thickness of the pipework. And that in turn will dictate the water quality provision. So if you're not maintaining the water chemistry, that will have an impact on how that pipe performs, which may impact therefore on its life. And lastly, you have the SFG reference, which is the code which brings you back. So you've got a direct correlation now, you never had it before, between RICS and SFG 20. And the calculation at the bottom is what we should be doing if we're assessing the true economic life of that asset. So to stay with that for a minute, here's an example. So I've said consider an asset with a life of 20 years, doesn't matter what it is, but the asset's been historically maintained on a break-fix reactive basis. Now we don't know why, but it could be due to budget constraints. It could be possibly because it was difficult to access it because it's in a small plant room. The asset operates 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. It's no longer manufactured by the OEM and spares are becoming a little bit difficult to obtain. So if we apply those variation factors that I touched on a minute ago, as I've done in red there, what we see is that the actual life, predicted life of that particular asset is no longer 20 years. It's only 16. Now consider, that's been in for 15 years and you're the maintenance man and you've now just had a bit of a wake-up call because actually you thought you had 5 more years on that asset, but the reality is you've now got 12 months. And that's going to hurt someone, and your finance man isn't going to be very happy because you're about to hit him with a surprise. So it's important that when you look at life factors, you consider them against the backdrop of history. As I say, it's a gross failing, I think, that people don't look at the variation factors. They just look at what that indicative life is and take it for gospel. Right, moving very quickly on then. Chapter 15 is about legislation and compliance. It plays very importantly on the need to keep demonstrable, evidential-based, comprehensive records. That's your get-out-of-jail card if something gets called into question. No records, you're on a sticky wicket. So, really important. You already know this. Act, regulation, ACOP guidance, that's the hierarchy. there's an awful lot of legislation and regulation around the built environment. It's massive. It's growing all the time. We've tried within Guide M to try and capture that to help people. So as a free download associated with it, there is a table which we put together which looks at system, action, frequency, who needs to do it, competent user, accredited company, those types of things. What the type of inspection is, so it might be operational, statutory, etc. And also gives you a guide to the legislation at the time of writing that was pertinent to that particular intervention. It is a massive area, and I think it's a big risk. If there was a greater workforce out there of external auditors and the health and safety executive came round a lot more, then I think the truth would be revealed. BISRIA have done some interesting information, some work recently with a number of respondents. Charities, for example, lowest scoring response, only 57% of the charities that responded actually said they were anywhere near compliant. The highest mark was only about 97% from memory. So everybody out there knows they're not compliant, but they only know based on what they're measuring. So I guess my word of caution here would be, if you don't know what it is you're supposed to be dealing with and you don't know what it is, actually don't trust your numbers. Go download that, it will help you. And that's the end. I'm sorry it's been a bit rushed, but there was a lot to go through. So I'll just finish by saying I wrote that presentation in that way so that when that's published on the CIBSE website, if you do download it, it's more of an aid memoir and a guide that you can go to it and you can see what's in each of those chapters. In hindsight, I could have probably done 17 separate presentations, one for each chapter, and we could have gone into the detail. But hopefully you'll get some use out of that. And I'm happy to take any questions if anybody has any.
In one of the earlier chapters, Steve, I think it was around about 8, it talks about commissioning and recommissioning buildings.
Yeah.
Is there much in the chapter or much in the industry to support your thinking, giving information about the benefits of doing that? Is there any financial or empirical?
The need for, well, yes and no. The reason that we've focused on that need for, certainly CISL commissioning is important. Empirically, I think what the industry has recognised is that more and more buildings are being built with future capacity, or the space for future capacity. So if you take an office block, which for example has only got 5 of its 10 floors let, and there's supposed to be, at the full load condition, say 5 chillers, and there's only 3 in, it's commissioned at a part load state. What we don't do is, when that building is now full of people and the additional chillers have been added, do we go back and retest and recommission the system? The answer is generally no. What people do is they go back and they recommission the 2 chillers in the circuit, but not the 5 chillers. So what that was trying to say in there is that there is a need to revisit buildings, because buildings aren't static. Buildings change.
Just more of an informed intervention.
Yes,
yeah.
Yes, yeah. Absolutely.
Steve, you know, early on in the I think that first slide was involving facilities management in the design phase.
Yes.
What barriers do you think exist on the side of the FMs that prevent them from joining the party?
What barriers?
Yeah.
I think initially some of those barriers are that there's no understanding at the very front end of who's going to be involved. So if you're a client which has an in-house FM function, then there are no barriers. But if it's going to be maintained by an external third party who's yet unknown, because the maintenance is going to be tendered at a later date, then that's more of a difficult question.
How prepared do you think, be it an outsourced FM or an in-house FM, how prepared and well supported are they to join the party in a meaningful way?
Well, I'd certainly in things like PFI and PPP, there is a will to do that. I've worked in a couple of organisations where there are very clear processes where the maintenance and the construction arms do get together very early doors, because there's a cognizance that actually the failing on one party will impact the other, and that therefore drives lack of profitability within the organisation. In the non-PFI market, in the commercial world, if I call it that, I think, if I'm being brutally honest, I think FMs say they would like to be involved, but there are probably few FMs that have got the true skill set to be able to inform what the designer's decisions are going to be and therefore contribute to that particular party.
Therein lies your iceberg.
Indeed. And that's not because there aren't FMs out there that aren't competent or don't understand. You've got to look at where those facilities managers have come from.
And can I just add to the FM one?
Yeah.
What the FM is initially concerned about is how much money have I got to maintain this asset?
Yes.
And where am I going to get that money from?
Mm-hmm.
Good presentation. What I'd like to understand, when the designer's finished designing,
Yep.
why is it not possible for the designer to put forward an expected forward maintenance database? They have all the assets, they've got all the information, and although those costs may be only relevant to a point in time,
Mm-hmm.
it allows people to put a budgetary consideration forward. No matter where the tender process goes,
Mm-hmm.
then the owner and the operator of the building has an idea of where his budget should be. Therefore, the FM can be involved and see how he can spend his money.
And that's done in several levels, isn't it?
Mm.
BIM is been cast to do that, exactly that. So the architect does come along with the client's brief and prepare the tenders. Another way you can approach it is by benchmarking price per square metre on different styles of building. That will also give you a very good yardstick in terms of what the maintenance is going to be.
Mm.
Can I just jump in here, Steve?
Mm.
Birmingham City Council, any capital scheme that we do, we get involved in putting together a revenue plan for the life of the building. So nothing gets past cabinet without a revenue cost for maintaining the building for the life of its construction.
I think one important point just picking up there, designers don't necessarily select equipment. Contractors select equipment based on cost.
Again, depending on, yes, on a D&B specifically, you're absolutely right.
Not just D&B.
Mm.
Most designers generally are pointed to real stage 4A.
Yeah.
It doesn't necessarily include supply chain integration.
Mm.
And that's probably the biggest problem.
And that's where you can lose a lot of money on FM if you buy
It is,
a lesser quality.
But there's no incentive set by clients
Mm.
to go down the FM route of making it, you know.
Yeah, it's that wonderful phrase, equal or approved, isn't it?
That's right.
Yeah. But in theory, who's that approved by? So if the designer's saying equal or approved,
What is it, approved by the design consultant?
well, it depends on what the design consultant's engaged to do. If he's only designed to take it up to a feasibility sketch scheme, then you're absolutely right. At that point, he stops, walks away with his fee, and the rest's now with the construction company.
The problem is sometimes he's novated to the contract.
In some instances, yes.
Therefore, the incentive changes.
I guess then you ask the question of the client who's actually paying for the building to be built, what's their business strategy? How much value do they put on getting design quality right at the off? And what their intent is for the building after it's built? Do they retain it? It was expected D&B type, not for disposal, but for placing on the market. And that's one of the issues, but appears later on in probably consideration of whole life economics
Yes.
of buildings is actually traditionally the UK property market has been founded on speculative design build, and so long as it looks nice to walk into, but the car park is next door to the front door, the lifts go up and down, and it's easy to get transport vertically and horizontally, and it looks pretty. Nobody actually gives a rat's ass, traditionally.
Yeah.
And if you read the good old Bernard Williams's Economics of Facilities,
Service cycle, yes.
yeah,
Yep.
and his approach to benchmarking building quality.
Mm.
That's basically all that people consider when they actually take on a new building. They don't actually take their FM or their maintenance contractor to look at, we'll touch up the barge pole, mate, or have you got a clause in the lease that sort of says the owner will do that.
Mm. But I think the key here is your point, Keith, and that is what incentive is there at the back end for the guy at the front end? There isn't any, because he walks away. And therein lies the challenge.
I still think that the process of assessment in terms of life cycle cost can be inbuilt in the design process. No matter where the building goes afterwards, there can be a guidance, if you like, and basically the council follow that anyway. So it's just trying to introduce that into the general scale of the process.
Yeah.
Or should make our installers maintain the buildings until they've finished it?
Or should get clients to pay true value. So that's
a
for
driver.
instance, FM don't get brought into the process to start the job. Not because they don't want to get involved in it, it's generally because the client won't pay for that at that particular site.
Well,
They won't allocate, even internal companies won't allocate resource until the design's complete or you're well into the installation stage. So it's the client not paying for it who's suffering.
And I think I alluded to that in one slide, or I didn't dwell on it, but maintenance is seen as a cost. It's not seen as delivering value to buildings. And until we get to that stage where maintenance is seen as a necessary rather than an evil, then we're not going to move forward. We are always going to be, the poor cousin, as it were.
That's a very good point. And on that note, I think we need to wrap up, but it's been a very good discussion. Very well presented, Steve.
Thank you.
Can we just thank Steve again? And thank you all again for your participation and